On a cool Friday morning in April, approximately 300 miles northeast of Rome, soldiers under the command of the Croatian Defense Council entered into the small village of Ahmici. This was one small element of a much larger offensive, with elaborate plans drawn up to assault 9 villages in the Lazva Valley at once. The village of Ahmici and its 1,500 people were on that plan. For several days, the Croatian Defense Council urged Croat people to flee the area, while Croat military units surrounded and cut off the villages. Telephone lines had been cut, units had been put into position, and all awaited the go-ahead signal from high command. At 5:30 in the morning, the assault commenced. Small groups of soldiers went house to house, throwing grenades into the homes and setting them on fire. The terrified inhabitants, who weren't immediately killed, were chased into a strategic zone south of the village, where snipers shot them in the back as they attempted to flee. Other survivors of the initial assault were simply shot at point-blank range or were rounded up and then executed. At the operation's completion, approximately 117 to 120 were killed in the village of Ahmici on April 16, 1993. But these were not soldiers or belligerents fighting in a war. They were not government agents of their nation-state fighting over ideology or resources. They were men, women, and children who happened to be Muslim Bosniaks. The massacre done at Ahmici was one of many other examples of what was now known as ethnic cleansing, a sanitized word that essentially meant cultural and religious genocide. The crimes of the villagers of Ahmici were that they were ethnically and religiously different from their Catholic Croat attackers, just one more incident of unbridled hatred and brutality that characterized the entirety of what was called the Bosnian War. All belligerents of the conflict participated in ethnic cleansing before the war's completion in 1995, and over the war's duration of about 4 years, this small Eastern European country of Bosnia-Herzegovina would see approximately 100,000 people killed and over 2.2 million people displaced. But these numbers also don't include the 12,000 to 20,000 women and children who were raped throughout the conflict. Indeed, the Bosnian War was the bloodiest war to be fought in Europe since World War II, and it concluded just 22 years ago. Throughout the Western world and in the US, it's not uncommon to hear the words, "diversity is our strength." But for the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina, diversity was the source of unbridled hatred and warfare. With the collapse of communism just a few years prior, and the splintering of the relatively stable government it provided, as awful as that was, the political mechanism of the nation-state in this small country began to unravel and break down along ethnic and religious lines. In 1991, before the Bosnian War, Bosnia-Herzegovina's 4.38 million residents were approximately 44% Muslim Bosniak, 32.5% Serb, and 17% Croat. In just 4 years, over half of this country would become refugees. For decades, if not centuries, this volatile region of the world fought, bled, and died in wars of ethnic hatred, ultimately boiling into the conflict we now know as the Bosnian War. But what do the denizens of a small Eastern European country have to do with the United States? What do the Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks have to do with transsexuality, especially when many transsexuals themselves are atheists? The answer is identity politics. In the aftermath of Donald Trump's election as the 45th President of the United States, I've been approached by more than one desperate person in near hysterics over the fate of the U.S. and what Trump's election means for the future. Many of these individuals are outraged and inflamed at the Democrats' presidential and congressional losses, fearing what a conservative Congress, presidency, and Supreme Court could mean for the future of their ideology. What I've come to notice from these individuals and from the subsequent riots, voter recounts, and electoral college pressures is the disturbing undercurrent of 2 commonalities: hatred and fear. I see the same hatred and fear in the defeated Democrats that I can see in the Serbs after they too lost their election in 1990. But even worse, I can see the same caustic mixture of hatred, fear, and outrage that comes when a country abandons its national identity for ethnic tribalism. The United States has historically prided itself as a nation of laws. For decades, the U.S. was united in the values it represented as a nation-state. Values like liberty, justice, freedom, and the American dream became just as recognizable internationally as the stars and stripes of the American flag. But in recent years, nationalism, patriotism, and even equal justice under the law have become politicized, polarized, and fractured along ideological and ethnic lines. The rise of organizations like La Raza, Black Lives Matter, and even the GLBT movement have emphasized the rights of ethnic and sexual groups over the rights of all members of the U.S. citizenry. For better or for worse, people have banded together not as citizens of a nation state, but as members of an expressed and defined minority. But what does this have to do with transsexuality? Transsexuality as a movement has had a difficult past. Trannies never reached the same numbers as the gays or lesbians within the GLBT movement, and in the past have been at direct odds by other members of this political coalition. Transsexuality just doesn't have the numbers needed to create their own political lobby without first attaching themselves to another group. In the realm of identity politics, transsexuals occupy the short end of an already very short political stick. It therefore comes to no surprise to me that so many transsexuals have approached me with both hatred and fear in their hearts after what they feel was a crushing defeat to the party they supported. After all, is it not the tyranny of the majority that sweeps away the desires of a political minority? Who will speak for such a small minority if their one sympathetic party had such a devastating blow? How will they advance their political agendas now? Many transsexuals and members of the greater GLBT movement are afraid for the future, but also angry. Angry at the Republicans whom they call racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, bigoted, and every other pejorative you can think of. To them, those backwards and hateful Republicans are not just wrong politically, but they're immoral people at the very heart of it. For those in the grip of identity politics, this wasn't just an election they lost, but the power and voice of their very tribe. Political fortunes of Democrats and Republicans in the United States wax and wane about every 8 years. The political pendulum swings back and forth each time. In the end, elections come and elections go. But the level of vitriolic bile only seems to be getting worse, more decisive, more extreme, and more violent as time has gone on. The hatred between the political parties only seems to be increasing, and so what chance do transsexuals have when their numbers are so low? The reality is the safest place for transsexuals of any background and ethnicity is, of course, in the Western nation state. Countries like the United States, who rule based on law and not based on identity, can still afford transsexuals the protections of the courts and due process. Why? Because the law protects everyone. While laws might be seen as unfair, unjust, or even undemocratic, those laws can still be changed. While officers and judges might be seen as bigoted or discriminatory, they can be replaced through political activism, better training, and community participation. But there is no rule of law in an ethnic conflict. What matters is who's like you and who's not. For the Croat soldiers entering the village of Ahmici, all that mattered was if a person was a Catholic Croat. Their weapons were not trained on foreign invaders, but on their neighbors, their schoolmates, their co-workers, and their countrymen. The massacre that took place at Ahmici was just one village in what later became known as the Lazva Valley ethnic cleansing that left over 2,000 people dead. But perhaps the most pertinent lesson to learn for a transsexual was that this act of genocide was committed by the Croats, the ethnic and religious group that was the smallest in size and strength in the conflict. As I mentioned earlier, the Croats made up only 17% of the population, a minority when compared either to the Serbs or the Bosniaks. In this regard, it was not the tyranny of the majority that slaughtered those men, women, and children at Ahmici, but a determined, hateful, and intolerant minority. No group, regardless of size, is inoculated against the horrific deprivations of hatred run amok. I won't speak further on the deprivations of the Bosnian War. As I mentioned, genocide was committed on all sides, and certainly there were greater massacres that took place apart from Ahmici. But the lessons of the Bosnian War are incredibly pertinent in our current time of identity politics and tribalism in the U.S. all groups, including transsexuals, benefit under the rule of law and equality of justice, not under ethnic and cultural tribalism. The value of the nation-state is that it unites everyone under a common banner. If transsexuals and other members of the GLBT movement truly feel threatened under the altered political landscape, then the safest place for them to be is not isolated in your ideological safe space, but instead speaking to your opposition and trying to find common ground as a nation-state. Empathy goes both ways. If transsexuals and members of the GLBT movement truly wish to end what they view as Christian bigotry, then align yourself on the path of reconciliation, not hatred. Demonizing your political and ethnic opponents, isolating yourselves, and then refusing to compromise with your opponents culminates in a murderous conclusion, just as it did in Ahmici 23 years ago. History has proven time and time again that radicalism and extremism only leaves mountains of corpses in its wake, and there's nothing written in stone that states the United States will forever remain free, open, prosperous, and tolerant, especially if it continues to fracture and divide itself through identity politics. Together as a nation and as transsexuals, we're stronger, safer, and more prosperous together than we are apart. If diversity is to be a strength, then let's unite under what the U.S. stood for as a nation-state. Liberty, freedom, equality under the law, and the American dream. The best way to honor the memories of those 120 people slaughtered at Ahmici and all of those people killed in the Bosnian War is to learn from history and then refuse to let it repeat. I'm Iron Liz, and thanks for listening. If you like the content of my podcasts, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below. The bigger the audience I can spread the heresy toward, the better. You can also follow me on Twitter at Iron Liz. Once again, I'm Iron Liz, and thanks for listening.